Introduction to Psychology. Chapter 2, Part 1. Lecture notes created by Dr. Michael J. Alicia, Adjunct Professor, Miami-Dade College, Social Science Department, Kendall Campus. This chapter will play an important foundation for the rest of the course by helping you develop an understanding of the nervous system and its relationship to behavior. We start by looking at neurons, the basic cells of the nervous system. We will consider the organization of the nervous system and a closely linked communication network, the endocrine system. We then move on to a guided tour of the brain and explore how certain brain areas are specialized to handle different functions. We will describe how the brain responds to environmental stimulation by literally altering its physical structure. The neuron, which is the basic unit of communications throughout the nervous system, takes place via neurons, cells that are highly specialized to receive and transmit information from one part of the body to another. Most neurons, especially those in your brain, are extremely small. It is important to recognize that neurons vary greatly in size and shape, reflecting their specialized functions. Neuron, a highly specialized cell that communicates information in electrical and chemical form. A nerve cell. There are three basic types of neurons, each communicating different kinds of information. Sensory neuron, the type of neuron that conveys information to the brain from specialized receptor cells in sense organs and internal organs, also called afferent neuron. Motor neuron, the type of neuron that signals muscles to contract, also called efferent neurons. Interneuron, the type of neuron that communicates information from one neuron to the next. Mirror neurons are not structurally different from other motor neurons. They are a distinct type of motor neuron that becomes activated both when individuals perform a motor act and when they observe the same motor act done by another individual. Most neurons have three basic components: a cell body, dendrites, and an axon. Cell body, the part of a cell that processes nutrients and provides energy for the neuron to function, contains the cell's nucleus, also called the soma. Short, branching fibers, called dendrites, extend from the cell bodies of most neurons. Dendrites receive messages from other neurons or specialized cells. Dendrites with many branches have a greater surface area, which increases the amount of information the neuron can receive. Some neurons have thousands of dendrites. The axon is a single elongated tube that extends from the cell body in most, though not all, neurons. Some neurons do not have axons. Axons carry information from the neuron to other cells in the body, including other neurons, glands, and muscles. In contrast to the potentially large number of dendrites, a neuron has only one axon exiting from the cell body. Axons can vary enormously in length. Most axons are very small. Some are no more than a few thousandths of an inch long. The axon extends from the base of your spine into your foot. Along with neurons, the human nervous system is made up of other specialized cells, called glial cells, or simply glia. Glial cells are abundant in the human brain. Glia is Greek for glue, and although they do not actually glue neurons together, the glia cell does provide structural support for neurons throughout the nervous system. There are several different kinds of glial cells, each with its own specialized function. Schwann cells in the nervous system form the myelin sheath, a white fatty covering that is wrapped around the axons. In much the same way that insulating plastic on electrical wires prevents interference when wires contact each other, myelin helps insulate one axon from the axons of other neurons. Neurons whose axons are wrapped in myelin communicate their messages up to 50 times faster than do unmyelinated neurons. Myelin formation may also be involved in learning new motor behaviors. The importance of myelin becomes readily apparent when it is damaged. For example, multiple sclerosis is a disease that involves the degeneration of patches of the myelin sheath. This degeneration causes the transmission of neural messages to be slowed or interrupted, resulting in disturbances in sensation and movement. Glial cells. There are many kinds of glial cells, or glia. They play an active role in brain functioning. The function of neurons is to transmit information throughout the nervous system. In general, messages are gathered by the dendrites and cell body and then transmitted along the axon in the form of a brief electrical impulse called an action potential. The action potential is produced by the movement of electrically charged particles, called ions, across the membrane of the axon. Some ions are negatively charged, while others are positively charged. Think of the axon membrane as a gatekeeper that carefully controls the balance of positive and negative ions on the interior and exterior of the axon. The axon membrane opens and closes ion channels that allow ions to flow into and out of the axon. Each neuron requires a minimum level of stimulation from other neurons or sensory receptors to activate it. This minimum level of stimulation is called the neuron's stimulus threshold. There is a difference in the electrical charge between the inside and the outside of the axon. There is a greater concentration of negative ions inside the neuron. Thus, the axon's interior is more negatively charged than the exterior fluid surrounding the axon. The negative electrical charge is about 70 millivolts, thousandths of a volt. The 70 millivolts are referred to as the neuron's resting potential. In this polarized negative inside positive outside condition, there are different concentrations of two ions, sodium and potassium. While the neuron is in resting potential, the fluid surrounding the axon contains a larger concentration of sodium ions than does the fluid within the axon. The fluid within the axon contains a larger concentration of potassium ions than is found in the fluid outside the axon. An action potential is triggered when the neuron is sufficiently stimulated by other neurons or sensory receptors. First, the neuron depolarizes. At each successive axon segment, sodium ion channels open for a mere thousandth of a second. This sequence of depolarization and ion movement continues down the entire length of the axon. Although, it is tempting to think of the action potential as traveling in much the same way as electricity travels through a wire, that is not what takes place in the neuron. The axon is a poor conductor of electricity. At each successive segment of the axon, the action potential is regenerated in the same way in which it was generated in the previous segment, by depolarization and the movement of ions. Once the action potential is started, it is self-sustaining and continues to the end of the axon. In other words, there is no such thing as a partial action potential. Either the neuron is sufficiently stimulated and an action potential occurs, or the neuron is not sufficiently stimulated and an action potential does not occur. This principle is referred to as the all or none law. After the action potential, the neuron enters a refractory period, lasting a thousandth of a second or less, during which the neuron cannot fire or generate another action potential. Instead, the neuron repolarizes and reestablishes the negative inside positive outside condition. Action potentials are generated in mere thousandths of a second. Thus, a single neuron can potentially generate hundreds of neural impulses per second. The primary function of a neuron is to communicate information to other cells, most notably other neurons. The point of communication between two neurons is called the synapse. The message-sending neuron is referred to as the presynaptic neuron. The message-receiving neuron is called the postsynaptic neuron. The presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons are separated by a tiny fluid-filled space, called the synaptic gap, which is only 20 to 40 nanometers wide. In most cases, when the presynaptic neuron is activated, it generates an action potential that travels to the end of the axon. At the end of the axon are several small branches, called axon terminals. Floating in the interior fluid of the axon terminals are tiny sacs called synaptic vesicles. The synaptic vesicles hold special chemical messengers manufactured by the neuron, called neurotransmitters. When the action potential reaches the axon terminals, some of the synaptic vesicles dock on the axon terminal membrane and then release their neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap. These chemical messengers cross the synaptic gap and attach to receptor sites on the dendrites of the receiving or postsynaptic neuron. Most often, they detach from the receptor and are reabsorbed by the presynaptic neuron, so they can be recycled and used again. This process is called reuptake. Reuptake also occurs with many of the neurotransmitters that failed to attach to a receptor and were left floating in the synaptic gap. Each neurotransmitter has a chemically distinct shape. Like a key in a lock, a neurotransmitter's shape must precisely match that of a receptor site on the postsynaptic neuron for the neurotransmitter to affect that neuron. Depending upon the receptor to which it binds, a neurotransmitter communicates either an excitatory or an inhibitory message to a postsynaptic neuron. An excitatory message increases the likelihood that the postsynaptic neuron will activate and generate an action potential. An inhibitory message decreases the likelihood that the postsynaptic neuron will activate. Your ability to perceive, feel, think, move, act, and react depends on the delicate balance of neurotransmitters in your nervous system. Yet neurotransmitters are present in only infinitesimal amounts in brain tissue. The connection between a neurotransmitter and an effect is not a simple one-to-one relationship. Most behaviors are the result of the complex interaction of different neurotransmitters. Further, neurotransmitters sometimes have different effects in different areas of the brain. Acetylcholine, the first neurotransmitter discovered, is found in all motor neurons. It stimulates muscles to contract, including the heart and stomach muscles. Whether it is as simple as the flick of an eyelash or as complex as a back flip, all movement involves acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is also found in many neurons in the brain, and it is important in memory, learning, and general intellectual functioning. People with Alzheimer's disease, which is characterized by progressive loss of memory and deterioration of intellectual functioning, have a severe depletion of several neurotransmitters in the brain, most notably acetylcholine. The neurotransmitter dopamine is involved in movement, attention, learning, and pleasurable or rewarding sensations. Evidence suggests that the addictiveness of many drugs, including cocaine and nicotine, is related to their ability to increase dopamine activity in the brain. The degeneration of the neurons that produce dopamine in one brain area causes Parkinson's disease, which is characterized by rigidity, muscle tremors, poor balance, and difficulty in initiating movements. The neurotransmitters serotonin and norepinephrine are found in many different brain areas. Serotonin is involved in sleep, sensory perceptions, moods, and emotional states, including depression. Note: antidepressant drugs, like Prozac, increase the availability of serotonin in certain brain regions. The most abundant neurotransmitters in the brain are two closely related neurotransmitters, glutamate and gamma-aminobutyric acid, abbreviated GABA. Like a dimmer switch, GABA regulates the level of neural activity in the brain. Too much GABA impairs learning, motivation, and movement, but too little GABA can lead to seizures. Note: alcohol makes people feel relaxed and less inhibited, partly by increasing GABA activity and decreasing glutamate, reducing overall brain activity. Glutamate is involved in learning, memory, and sensory processes, Morris 2013. Too much glutamate can overstimulate the brain, causing seizures and cell death. Glutamate is also implicated in endorphins, or another important class of neurotransmitter. Chemically like morphine, heroin, and other opioid drugs, endorphins are hundreds of times more potent and are released in response to stress, trauma, and pain. Many drugs, especially those that affect moods or behavior, work by affecting the normal functioning of neurotransmitters in the synapses. Some drugs increase or decrease the amounts of neurotransmitters released by neurons. One way in which drugs can prolong the effects of the neurotransmitters is by blocking the reuptake of the neurotransmitters by the sending neuron. For example, the antidepressants Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, also called SSRIs. Drugs can also mimic specific neurotransmitters. An agonist is a drug or other chemical that binds to a receptor and facilitates synaptic transmission. Often, agonist drugs are chemically like a specific neurotransmitter and produce the same effect. Alternatively, a drug can act as an antagonist by blocking the effect of neurotransmitters. A drug may fit into receptor sites and prevent neurotransmitters from acting. Specialized for communication, up to 1 trillion neurons are linked throughout your body in a complex, organized communication network called the nervous system. The human nervous system is divided into two main divisions: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The neuron is the most important transmitter of messages in the central nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, communication occurs along nerves, which are made up of large bundles of neuron axons. The central nervous system, CNS, includes the brain and the spinal cord. The central nervous system is so critical to your ability to function that it is entirely protected by bone, the brain by your skull, and the spinal cord by your spinal column. Surrounding and protecting the brain and the spinal cord are 3 layers of membranous tissues, called the meninges. The brain and spinal cord are suspended in cerebrospinal fluid to protect them from being jarred. Cerebrospinal fluid also fills 4 hollow cavities in the brain, called ventricles. The inner surfaces of the ventricles are lined with neural stem cells, specialized cells that generate neurons in the developing brain. The central nervous system as the central processing center. Every action, thought, feeling, and sensation you experience is processed through the central nervous system. The most important element of the central nervous system is the brain, which acts as the command center. Although most behaviors are controlled by your brain, spinal reflexes are simple, automatic behaviors that occur without any brain involvement. A spinal reflex is a simple, involuntary behavior that is processed in the spinal cord without brain involvement. If you accidentally shock yourself by using a metal fork to pry a bagel out of a plugged-in toaster, you will instantly pull your hand away from the painful stimulus. The peripheral nervous system is the other major division of your nervous system. The peripheral nervous system comprises all the nerves outside the central nervous system that extend to skin. The communication functions of the peripheral nervous system are handled by its two subdivisions, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system communicates sensory information received by sensory receptors along sensory nerves to the central nervous system. And it carries messages from the central nervous system along motor nerves to perform voluntary muscle movements. The other subdivision of the peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system, which regulates involuntary functions such as heartbeat, blood pressure, breathing, and digestion. The autonomic nervous system is not completely self-regulating. By engaging in physical activity or purposely tensing or relaxing your muscles, you can increase or decrease autonomic activity. Emotions and mental imagery also influence your autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is the body's emergency system, rapidly activating bodily systems to meet threats or emergencies. When you are frightened, your breathing accelerates, your heart beats faster, digestion stops, and the bronchial tubes in your lungs expand. All these physiological responses increase the amount of oxygen available to your brain and muscles. These and other bodily changes collectively represent the fight or flight response. They physically prepare you to fight or to flee from a perceived danger.